say that I came to NCM since I was a student to meet the celebrities that studied neural control of movement, so it feels like a little bit exciting, and of course I feel like in shock that I happen to be a celebrity for a day, so thank you, especially with this auditorium. So I'll tell you the work that we've been doing with my students. They are here in this picture, and I don't know if we can dim a little bit just the lines in the front, perhaps, so that the slides can see better. Well, I don't know. Perhaps. Okay. Anyway, while they work on that, I'll just get started. And why did I decide to study sensory motor adaptation? And the reason is, I'm very interested in the possibility to improving people's gait, and I found really compelling this evidence by Julia Choi in the audience, and also my mentor, Amy Bashman. So let me show you what they found. So this is a video of a child that had a hemispherectomy as a treatment for Rasmussen syndrome. And what you can see is that she has a hemiparetic gait. So half of her cortex in this particular case is the left side has been removed, and she walks with an asymmetric gait, and it looks as if she was like limping, right? Now what Julia and Amy found is that if you make this child walk on the treadmill that has two belts that can move at different speeds, so I'm illustrating at the bottom like some schematic of the speed difference that they experience, what you observe is that they show that they can improve their gait. But at the beginning of the adaptation period, when you just make the two belts move at different speeds, obviously the child has some difficulty walking in this abnormal situation. Now, after a relatively short period of time, so this is 16 to 30 minutes, what you see is that she is, even though the two belts are still moving at different speed, she has the remaining flexibility to counteract this predictable and sustained perturbation. So that's great, right? It's good that she has that capacity, but even more impressive is that when you remove that speed difference and make the two belts move at the same speed again, now what you see is that her gait is more smoother and also more symmetric than it used to be. So just to remind you, like the environment itself is moving in the exact same situation. The two belts are moving at the same speed, yet whatever recalibration of the motor system that occurred during this period has helped her walk better. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, sign me up. I really want to study sensory motor adaptation. Now Darcy, later on, also with Amy, showed that there were long-term effects. So I'll show you. So here, what they're presenting is a step asymmetry. So that's a measure of a kinematic measure. So you can consider that the distance between when you take a step with one leg or with the other, if that difference is distinct from zero, then people are walking with asymmetric steps, like the video that I showed you. Now, at the beginning, so in this case, in Darcy's work, is with patients that had a stroke, so with unilateral lesions because of a stroke, you observe that patients are asymmetric as well, as in the video that I showed you. Now, after 1 month of training in this split situation, now there's an improvement, and there's a reduction in that gait asymmetry that we originally observed. And then people go to their homes, and then 1 month and 3 months follow-up, that improvement is sustained. So that's great. Yet, Darcy also showed that 5 out of the 12 people that she tested didn't have any improvements. So they are asymmetric when they arrived, they are still asymmetric 1 month later after training, and then in the follow-up sessions. So these type of results have been reproduced more recently by Michael Lewis. So this really piqued my curiosity in the sense that I found it really intriguing why not all patients improved. And that has been really the motor that has underlined the research that we do in the lab. So we study particularly this process of sensory motor adaptation in the context of locomotion and how it generalizes, like the recalibration of movements, how they generalize when they walk on the treadmill to walking over ground versus continuing walking on the treadmill, right? So it's two different contexts. So I'll tell you two stories about that, and let me know what you think. Okay, so in the context of motor adaptation, we study as an output what happens to muscle activity, what are the changes that occur, and can those be informative of the process of sensory motor adaptation that is of interest. So the motivation to do this, so why would you study muscle activity? And as a student, when I was with Lina, I asked that question as well. And then she said, I'm not paraphrasing, but well, I am paraphrasing. I don't remember how she said it, but what I know is that she indicated that it would be in behavioral studies like the ones that I do, the motor output to the nervous system, when it's quantified in terms of muscle activity, so it's more direct motor output of the motor system compared to kinematics or kinetics. So to make that argument a bit clearer, imagine that the work of one of my friends and colleague, Steve Collins, he's one of many people that show that passive walkers move like humans in terms of how their gait. Notice that it's particularly symmetric it is. And yet they have little to no active control, right? So that's what motivated me to do the studies that I'm going to show you about the characterization of muscle activity. Now, there are some challenges with doing this, right? And then I'll try to illustrate those challenges. So when you ask people why not characterize muscle activity, it's unclear, at least in the context of locomotion, it was unclear whether it would be indicative of anything other than a transition in the environment. So let me try to illustrate that with a video. So this is a visitor that came to my lab recently and kindly wanted to try the treadmill, and then also didn't mind me sharing his responses. So what you see is that when you first induce the perturbation and you make one side move faster than the other, you observe this clear sort of balance and corrective response that he's experiencing. Now, after the person has been adapted, and now, again, you transition and remove that, another transition in the environment person, which you make the two belts go from being at different speed to move at the same speed. Once again, you observe some corrective balance response. So, again, it was believed that this corrective response was not really informative of anything other than the fact that there has been a change in the environment and people are reacting to that change. So with my student Pablo, we considered the possibility that was not the case. And I'm going to try to show you that. So first of all, what is that we define by corrective responses? So unlike reaching, where it's there's very discrete movements and you know exactly the onset of the perturbation, and you can do some temporal decomposition to characterize corrective responses or feedback responses, it's not the same for walking, right? It's a continuous motion, sort of periodic, and it's not clear when the perturbation occurs, right? Because you can imagine you're walking and all of a sudden one side starts moving faster, the other one starts moving slower. So even if you could say, okay, the perturbation occurs when people hit the ground, the other leg is also moving, so it's really not clear to do that kind of decomposition is not possible. So we had to become a little bit more creative and try to say, okay, let's start with a very simple definition of corrective response, which is simply a change in muscle activity. And by a change, I mean, let's look at the mean activity and before and after the transition occurred, and let's look at how that activity changes. And what I'm going to show you is that the structure of those changes are informative of what's the state of the motor system in terms of recalibration. So hopefully I can convince you of that. And of course, this is the work of Pablo Turari and my lab. So let me illustrate that to our hypothesis. So you can imagine that if you have three muscles, for example, and let's just calculate the corrective responses of these three muscles when the normal state gets perturbed such that the right leg is moving faster than the left leg. Okay, so when that transition happens, what we observe is that one muscle decreases activity, the other two muscles increase activity. So that's the pattern of activity that we're going to be studying. Now, if people experience the opposite perturbation, so that means the left leg is now moving faster than the right leg. So this perturbation is exactly the opposite than the one that I showed you before. Now, the changes in muscle activity that one would experience have a distinct pattern. So in this particular case, that muscle didn't change activity, muscle 2 increases activity again, and muscle 3 decreases activity. So that pattern of activity, notice that it's not the negative or the exact negative of what we experienced before, and we're going to exploit that to characterize sensory motor adaptation. So, one thing to remember is, once again, in both situations, the normal state is walking with the two legs moving at the same speed, and in both cases, we're perturbing that normal, either in one direction or in the other. Okay, so if after that perturbation, we maintain that split environment for a short period of time, and then we remove the perturbation, what you can experience is that expect that the change in muscle activity that you would observe is going to be exactly the opposite of what you originally experienced. So the muscle that went down is going to increase in activity, and vice versa. The muscles that went up will decrease activity. Okay, so you're just removing the perturbation that you first introduced, so you're going to see a reversal, right? If you consider that the input to the motor system is precisely that difference in bell speeds, that's exactly what a linear time invariant system would predict. Okay, now, after a long period of time, we say that that change in activity that I told you would be simply environment-based if what you observe is exactly the same removal of perturbation that you originally observed. And why is that? Because either after a short perturbation or a long perturbation, the way that the environment is changing is exactly the same. Okay? Now, on the other hand, if people have recalibrated their system parameters or their motor system, and consider the split situation as the new normal, then you can realize that experiencing the removal of the perturbation is equivalent to experiencing a perturbation in the exact opposite direction to the one that they originally had. Okay, so with that in mind, the expectation is that the corrective responses would have a structural pattern that is exactly the same to the ones that you would experience with a perturbation in the opposite direction, de novo. Okay, so with that in mind, now we have a nice regression equation in which we say, okay, to test our hypothesis, if changes in muscle activity are mostly indicative of a change in environment, then we would mostly observe that kind of pattern that we can predict based on the initial responses, and that's going to be indicative, how much of that is going to be indicated by that coefficient, whereas if it's adapted, we're going to see mostly these other kind of responses, and it's going to be quantified by this other coefficient. Okay? So that's our regression equation. So that's what we did. So we characterize the structure of the responses and see how this changes. Now, again, I showed you three responses in a cartoon type of way. This is how we actually, how those two examples of two muscles, how they look, their envelope as a function of the gait cycle, where in the baseline condition is in gray, in the green condition after the transition is during early adaptation is in green. And what I want to show you is that, here I told you that there was an increase in activity overall, but you can imagine that we can discretize the gait cycle into different time bins and see how the changes that occur in muscle activity over the gait cycle. Okay, so those are the vectors that you're going to be observing. And a decrease is going to be indicated in blue if the change was a decrease, and an increase is going to be indicated in red. Okay. Those dots simply indicate that this is statistically significant, those changes that occur there. Coming from Linus lab, you can imagine I was not content to recording two muscles. I recorded like 30 muscles, like 15 on one side and 15 on the other. And I'm going to show you the pattern of muscle activity for only one side, but the same is observed on the other side. So we can observe that those two vectors that I showed you for two muscles, now we have a matrix or a checkerboard, we call it in the lab, of every row represents the modulation of muscle activity per muscle over the gait cycle. And this is for the non-dominant leg. Okay, so when we remove the perturbation, that's the pattern of activity that we observe. I think it's important to notice that not all the muscles went up, like an increase in impedance or something like that, right? There's some muscles went down, some muscles went up. Okay. Now, if you look at what would be predicted by the adaptive-based change or the environment-based change, notice that the checkerboards for the adaptive base look more similar to what we actually observe than the one that would be predicted by the environment-based change. Okay, so with that in mind, we have a regression equation to quantify that. So what I'm showing you on this scatter plot, yes. So it's the mean coefficient and confidence interval for that. For this regression equation, and what we observe is that there's more of this beta adapt coefficient is close to 1, and the relatively small environment-based structure. On the other hand, after a short period of time, we observe the opposite. We observe a little bit of the adapting base and a lot of the environment-based changes. Okay, so that's great. This is at the level of the group. Now, if you look at individual subjects and look at apply this regression model to each one of the subjects, what we observe is that as a function of age, those individuals that are older, so here I'm plotting those coefficients, the beta adapt and non-adapt, and what you observe is that as you get older, you apply relatively more this kind of corrective responses based on the environmental change as opposed to adaptive. What does that mean? So it means that, imagine that people that are older, they're walking on this split situation, and they're like, even though they can adjust the movements to that situation, as soon as you remove the perturbation, they're like, okay, I can go back to normal, and they just sort of like immediately switch back. Whereas in people that are younger, they do recalibrate the muscle system, and they consider the new situation as the new normal. Okay, now to make my point that muscle activity can be more informative than kinematics, if you compare the if you compute the typical type of, the conventional measure that we use to assess adaptation in locomotion is the step length asymmetry. So if you put the step length asymmetry after effects as a function of age, then we do not observe this same type of relation that I showed you in muscle space. Okay, so what is that I said? That the structure of corrective responses are actually indicative of the adapted state of the environment, of the motor system, as opposed to just simply a change in the environment. I also told you that this decomposition allows you to reveal age-related deficits in how much people can adapt. Okay, then what happens with stroke? So we're going to be using the same thing. Is there a recalibration in their corrective responses, and what happens in the performance in terms of in this novel split situation? So for that, Pablo worked with Digna in the lab, and they collected activity on 15 subjects at the chronic stage. They were mild to moderate type of individuals. They had unilateral lesions, and they're intact. Their cerebellum was intact. Okay, so if you look at the corrective responses that we observe when you remove the perturbation after they have been adapted, they look like this checkerboard, and once again, they are more similar to whatever would be expected from a response in the opposite direction than from an environment-based type of change. With the same regression model, we show that, once again, as a group, the stroke individuals do not differ from controls in terms of the recalibration of the motor system. So what is different in these patients? So now for that, we look at the steady state pattern that they reach, and how does that change compared to baseline walking? When you look at that, what you observe is that control subjects and stroke modulate their muscle activity differently. So here I'm just showing you the activity of the paralytic side for one leg, and the non-dominant leg, which was walking in the same way as the non-paralytic in the split environment. Okay, so what you see is that there are some muscles, like particularly some quad muscles or hamstrings and maybe the TA, that are modulated in the control subjects, and in the stroke individuals cannot induce those changes. Okay, we characterize that again by looking at, so we transform our checkerboard into a vector, and we simply say, okay, let's compare the structure of that vector for every individual to the one of the group for the controls, and that cosine would indicate the degree of similarity between those vectors. So what we observe is that if you look at the controls compared to the stroke, particularly in the non-paralytic side, there are a lot of differences, whereas overall, whereas the corrected side is a little bit less. Now, if we regress that metric of similarity against Fugl-Meyer, so Fugl-Meyer is a measure that tells you functionally the level of impairment of these patients. What we observe is that patients that are more impaired, so low values means more impairment, and 34 is a typical behavior. So what you observe is that the activity is more dissimilar when the patients are more impaired than when they're less severely impaired. Okay, so what is that I said? Is that in terms of recalibration of the corrective responses, there seems to be no differences after stroke. So there is this suggesting that perhaps there's this hemispheric independent process, the one of motor recalibration that we're studying. I also told you that what is impaired seems to be their capacity to produce the movements that are necessary for this challenging task of moving the two bells, in which the two legs are moving at different speeds. Okay, so the normal question to ask is like, okay, can you modulate that? And that's what my student, well, former student, now PhD student, well, no, now PhD, Dr. Harley Sunbrick showed. So what she showed is that if you manipulate the forces that people experience when they are on the split belt treadmill, you can alter how much they change in the split environment, in terms of kinematics at least. So this is a measure of step leg asymmetry that I showed you before. And what she did, she manipulating forces by making people walking incline is in green, flat is the typical behavior, and decline is in red. And what you observe is that in the process of adaptation, those individuals that walked incline adapted more than the other individuals. Okay, so the level of adaptation that people reached was different. So with that in mind, you can imagine that, okay, can we do this with individuals with stroke and induce more changes in their kinematics? And that's what we observed. So she had people walking on the split condition in the flat, that's in yellow, and then the same individuals came back and walked in the incline condition, and the change, how much they adapted was distinct. And here she's showing that not only the level of adaptation, but the changes that occur when people walk flat versus when they walk incline in this in every single subject that was tested. Okay, so now we're looking at changes in muscle activity. Okay, so what did I say? That there's an age dependency in the process of sensorimotor recalibration, that these perhaps people age differently, as you can imagine, so perhaps there are some age-related differences, and now we have a larger data, we are working on having a larger data sample for each age group to potentially identify subject-specific differences across the different ages. Now, I also show you that perhaps there's a cerebral dependency in the execution of motor commands, particularly in a challenging environment, but the recalibration process that results from that is not affected. So we are working to figure out whether the steady state in these patients can improve with incline walking, and what will be the impact of gait asymmetry in this recalibration process. And I'm particularly interested in testing cerebellar individuals because they are thought not to be able to recalibrate, so I assume that their corrective responses would look really like what it would be expected from an environmental change. Okay, so that was the one study. Now, the other study is about generalization. So you can imagine that one typical finding, not only for walking, but in any type of rehabilitation robotics type of problem, is that when people are using the device, the carryover to the situation with the device is distinct without the device. So, for example, if people walk on the treadmill after the two bells have moved at different speed, the changes in their kinematics, so I'm showing you the after effects, are going to be greater both in controls and in stroke individuals compared to those that happen when they walk over ground. So there's like some non-linearity, like a switch from one context to another, and that's what of a lot of interest to us. So one hypothesis is that occurs because the two contexts are so different that if you could perhaps make them more similar, then you could improve that recalibration, the generalization of that recalibration. So by different, I mean like when you're on a treadmill, your eyes are telling you that you're not moving, but your legs are telling you that you are. That's really specific to the treadmill. In addition, a treadmill is a very odd situation in which you cannot control your speed. So that self-regulation of speed, we think, is really important in terms of having some naturalistic situation. and also how you initiate your steps. So instead of reacting to the treadmill, you decide when to start and when to stop. So to test this, we worked with a group at CMU, and they basically were designing these shoes for commuting purposes, and I just asked if they could move at different speeds, and they said yes, so we started doing this. And what you can see is pretty fun. So you have, it's like a pair of skates, but the wheels are locked so that they cannot rotate on their own. People are actually walking in order to move forward. Now, in addition, they have a little bit of actuation so that when your foot is on the ground, you can move faster than whatever speed you would normally go. So it's like walking on a walkway if they're both moving at the same speed. Now, what you can see in this case, so we're making this side move faster than this other one. If you look at what Jasher showed, is that if you look at the kinematics with these Nimbus shoes or with a split block treadmill, the time course of adaptation is very similar across the two, right? So in red is with these shoes, and in blue is with the treadmill. And we can characterize that by looking at the perturbation that happens, the average of the first few steps during early adaptation in that steady state, and then importantly, how much after effects you have later, same, and then steady state. Okay, so with that in mind now, the interesting question is what happens when you wear the shoes and you remove them versus just turning them off. And what we observed, once again, by looking at the step asymmetry, is that with those shoes, the carryover will be comparable to without the shoes. So that seems interesting. Okay. And compared to the treadmill, this carryover is much better. Okay, so it seems that the task similarity between the training and the testing context is very important for the generalization of recalibration. And what we're doing, what we're in progress, is we're trying to quantify long-lasting changes, once again, in muscle activity from that occurring adaptation to post-adaptation. So with that, with Pablo, what we're doing is just, using state space modeling, but simply as not as a mechanistic tool, but most like a system identification type of tool to look at what are the changes that occur during adaptation, what are the time constants, and how do they decay. So we observe, for example, if you look at the hidden states that reproduce the underlying changes in muscle activity one stride to the next, what you observe is that there are some that are really long and some that are very short. Like by long, I mean 900 strides versus short, like 6 strides. Okay, so, and of course, this gives us a framework to start looking at the nonlinearities that occur during the transition. So like what I told you, these are the two studies. Obviously, there are some other things that we look at, and I'm mostly going to show it to you because I'm very interested to know what you think about us in offline conversations. So, I told you, Carly also looks at the adaptation of forces. We are very interested in understanding this relation between the spatial, the control of the limit space and time, and how movements are perceived before and after adaptation. Now, in terms of generalization, we look at changes, aspects that mediate this generalization process in a subconscious type of manner, versus some that are more explicit, like, for example, action selection, how that determines how much carryover is going to occur. Okay, so I want to end by thanking my brother. So he's right here, inaugurating the lab. So Esteban was born with a brain vision, and growing up with him has really inspired me to be in this field, so I want to thank him for that. I also want to thank, my parents and of course, my sister for being so encouraging all the time. My mentors, their support and advice has been really, really important for my career. And of course, my family, kids and husband, we're eating churros when one of us is, and it's really great. So they keep me happy and balanced. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to thank, of course, the students who are doing all the work, and funding agencies. Without them, we could not do the work. And of course, you for this tremendous recognition, and also for keeping us going. Okay? I'm happy to take any questions now.